Today, I'll tell you the story of Joaquín, a man trapped under the weight of a silence that has lasted 15 years. One night, a knock at the door confronts him with a past he swore to bury. Will he embrace a second chance or lose what he loves most forever? On a cold December afternoon, the sound of a branch snapping made Don Joaquín turn his head toward the window. For a moment he thought someone was watching him from the overgrown garden he tended only out of habit, but there was no one, just the wind swaying the bare branches of the trees. He sank back into his armchair, his heart still racing. It wasn't the first time he'd had that feeling, though he always dismissed it as a product of his imagination. At 78 years old, Joaquín lived in a house seemingly frozen in time, with old furniture and faded walls bearing the marks of an entire life. Since breaking ties with his son 15 years ago, his world had shrunk to silence and solitude. He fed his old canary, Pipo, and spent afternoons looking at photographs that no longer brought comfort but served as constant reminders of what he had lost. The garden, once blooming with roses his late wife had adored, was now a stretch of dry grass and wild bushes. He had tried to care for it in the early years after his wife's death, but over time his resolve faded, just like the contact with his only family. The last thing he'd heard about Eduardo, his son, was that he'd moved to the city with his wife and their children, a pair of twins Joaquín had never met. Whenever he thought of them, his chest filled with a mix of regret and wounded pride. They had argued over something trivial that escalated into a major conflict, like a spark igniting a dry field. Both had stood firm, and now Joaquín lived with a loneliness he didn't know how to alleviate. That same night, as he lit the old dining room lamp, something unusual happened. His landline phone, which rarely rang, began to vibrate on the table. For a second, he froze, staring at the device as if it were a relic from another life. Finally, he picked it up, but all he heard on the other end was the sound of the wind. Almost immediately, someone knocked at the door. It was a dry, unexpected knock that echoed through the empty house. Joaquín stood frozen, still holding the receiver. His heart pounded as he walked toward the entrance, sensing that something was about to change. When he opened the door, no one was there. Only the icy night air, and at his feet, a small sealed envelope with no sender. The wall clock struck 9 at night, but Don Joaquín's house remained steeped in an unsettling silence. New Year's Eve had never been lonelier. On the dining table, a lit candle cast flickering shadows over an empty plate and a glass of water. He had considered opening a can of sardines with some stale bread, but the thought of eating alone once again had taken away his appetite. His eyes rested on an old framed photograph next to the lamp. It was from another time, when the table was laden with overflowing dishes and the house vibrated with laughter and toasts. In the picture, his son Eduardo, then a lively young man, embraced his mother while Joaquín looked at them with a pride that now felt as distant as it was unattainable. Remembering those family gatherings felt like sinking into quicksand. A knock at the door broke his train of thought, startling him. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the hour was unusual for visitors. He got up with effort, feeling the weight of his years in his legs, and walked cautiously toward the entrance. The house seemed to hold its breath as he turned the lock and opened the door. Before him stood two teenagers, looking at him with a mix of shyness and anticipation. A tall boy with messy hair and a smile that barely masked his discomfort, and a smaller girl holding a cake wrapped in cellophane. Joaquín recognized them immediately, though the memory of their faces was blurred by time. They were his grandchildren, Eduardo's children. "Grandpa, Happy New Year," said the boy, extending his hand. Joaquín hesitated, as if his mind needed time to process what he was seeing. Finally, he clumsily shook the young man's hand. The girl stepped forward and added softly, "Dad asked us to come and get you. We'd love for you to have dinner with us tonight." The words left him paralyzed. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The icy night air crept through the open door, and the cake, trembling slightly in the girl's hands, mirrored his emotions. Joaquín felt a rush of conflicting feelings: joy, fear, disbelief. "Does Eduardo know you're here?" he finally asked, his voice shaky with confusion. The girl nodded with a slight smile. "Yes, Grandpa. Everyone's waiting for you." Joaquín glanced back inside his house, where everything remained dark and empty. His heart raced at the thought of stepping into a room filled with familiar yet estranged faces. Part of him wanted to close the door and retreat into his world of routine and silence. But another, stronger part urged him to take the step he had avoided for years. Joaquín closed the door softly after bidding farewell to his grandchildren, who promised to return in an hour to take him to dinner. He remained standing, leaning against the wooden frame, his heart pounding in his chest. The initial surge of emotion gave way to a flood of doubts. How would Eduardo receive him after all these years? Could he bear the weight of the past and the judging eyes? Lost in thought, he heard a faint tap on the window. Turning, he saw Clara, his neighbor, smiling warmly at him from the garden. With her hair tied back and a gray shawl draped over her shoulders, she exuded a calmness that Joaquín deeply envied. "Joaquín, open the door," she called out without waiting for an invitation. She entered the house with the ease of someone who had crossed that threshold countless times. Carrying a bag in her hand, her gaze was firm, as if she already knew what he needed. "I saw them leaving a moment ago. Your grandchildren, right?" she asked, setting the bag on the table. Joaquín nodded silently, unable to find the words to express how he felt. "Then why are you standing here, as if the world were ending? They're waiting for you." "I don't know if I can, Clara," he confessed, his voice trembling. "It's been so many years, so many unresolved things. What if I'm not welcome? What if I make everything worse?" Clara looked at him with compassion, but without indulgence. "Joaquín, we don't always get second chances, and when they come, they're often fragile. If you let them slip away, they might never come back." She gestured to the empty table and the old plate. "Do you really want to stay here tonight with Pipo and that stale piece of bread, instead of sitting with your family? If you can't do it for yourself, do it for them. Because trust me, pride doesn't fill the void that loneliness leaves behind." Without waiting for an answer, she pulled a neatly folded suit from the bag. "This belonged to my late husband, and it's still in good shape. I doubt yours is ready for the occasion," she joked, trying to lighten the mood. Joaquín took the suit with trembling hands. "What if I can't? What if Eduardo reproaches me for everything?" Clara stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, Then you listen, and you tell him you're sorry, because it's not about how many words you say, Joaquín, but that you're there. That's enough to start. Before leaving, Clara turned at the door. I'll take care of your house and Pipo. Now go and do what you need to do, and don't forget to wear the tie. Joaquín watched her disappear into the darkness, his gaze returning to the suit in his hands. Determination began to replace fear. Second chances don't come often, he repeated to himself, and this time he wasn't going to let it slip away. With trembling hands, Joaquín adjusted the tie Clara had lent him. The suit was a bit snug, but he didn't care. Standing in front of the hallway mirror, he saw himself as he hadn't in years, dressed for an important occasion. Yet his eyes betrayed the nerves he felt. The echo of his footsteps resounded through the empty house as he made his way to the door, just as he heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. When he opened it, the headlights of his grandchildren's car illuminated the entrance. The boy got out first, approaching to help him with the door as the girl waited with a smile from the passenger seat. Joaquín descended the steps slowly, feeling his heart pound harder with every step. "Ready, Grandpa? Let's go. We don't want to be late," said the young man enthusiastically, opening the back door. Joaquín let himself be guided, grateful for the energy radiating from the two of them. As the car started, he let out a long sigh, trying to calm the nerves that refused to leave him. As they drove through the brightly lit streets, Joaquín observed how much the city had changed. New buildings, gleaming shop windows, and Christmas lights adorning the avenues. It was a world that no longer belonged to him, and that feeling deeply unsettled him. He looked at his grandchildren's hands, one on the wheel, the other holding a phone. Young, steady, full of life. In stark contrast to his own, wrinkled and trembling. Yet for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something akin to hope. "How are your parents?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Dad's a little nervous about seeing you, but he's also happy, Grandpa. So much has happened." "We'll tell you everything when we get there," the girl replied, turning to him with a warm smile. Joaquín nodded, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. He watched as the city lights reflected on the window, casting shadows on his face. His mind wandered between memories and questions, imagining what it would be like to walk through that door after so many years. "Grandpa, do you want us to stop somewhere first? Is there anything you need?" the boy asked, showing a thoughtfulness that surprised him. "No, thank you, son. I'm fine," Joaquín replied, though he wasn't entirely sure those words were true. The car turned a corner, and Joaquín could make out the silhouette of a brightly lit house in the distance. Warm lights shone from every window, and a Christmas tree stood proudly behind the curtains. His heart skipped a beat. They were arriving. The time for thinking was over. Now he had to face the past and, perhaps, a new future. The bustle of the house greeted him like a warm wave as he stepped inside. The smell of roasted turkey and spices filled the air, and the echo of children's laughter spilled in from the living room where they played with gifts wrapped in shiny paper. Joaquín paused at the threshold, watching a complete family enjoy New Year's Eve, a scene that had long ceased to be part of his life. "Dad," Eduardo said upon seeing him. He stood on the other side of the entrance, dressed in a simple but neatly pressed shirt. His expression was hard to read, a mix of nerves, curiosity, and what Joaquín could only interpret as restrained relief. Joaquín nodded slightly, unable to muster more than a faint greeting. The words he had rehearsed on the way vanished in an instant. "Happy New Year, Don Joaquín. It's such a pleasure to have you here," added Carmen, Eduardo's wife, with a sincere smile as she gave him a brief but warm hug. The grandchildren guided him to the table, where a place was clearly set for him. A clean tablecloth, a porcelain plate, and a gleaming glass. Yet, even amidst the warmth and lights, Joaquín felt the weight of tension in the air. Memories of past arguments seemed to rise like invisible shadows, present in every pause in the conversation. As the dishes were served, Carmen tried to fill the silences with stories about the children, anecdotes from school, and vacation plans. The grandchildren chimed in enthusiastically, sharing details about their friends and activities, trying to pull Joaquín into the present. He smiled, nodded, and asked brief questions, grateful for the young one's efforts to ease the awkwardness. Eduardo remained more reserved, speaking only when necessary, but his eyes stayed on Joaquín, as if searching his face for something, a sign, a word to undo the years of separation. Joaquín tried several times to direct a comment to him, even something as simple as asking about his work or how he had spent the past years, but the words felt heavy, stuck in his throat like stones. The tensest moment came when one of the grandchildren mentioned a memory of the last time their grandfather had been at the house with them. Eduardo looked down, focusing on his glass, while Carmen quickly changed the subject, talking about one of the boys' school projects. Joaquín felt a knot in his stomach. The wounds hadn't fully healed, and it was clear that time hadn't erased the pain. As the dinner progressed, Joaquín began to notice the small gestures, the way Carmen served him more mashed potatoes without him asking, the effort his grandchildren made to share their stories, even Eduardo's kind but cautious tone. He realized that while the road to reconciliation would be long, the mere act of being there was already a step forward. Despite the awkward moments, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging. After dinner, the grandchildren carried the dishes to the kitchen while Eduardo and Carmen took care of the final touches for dessert. Joaquín remained seated for a moment, silently observing how everyone moved in harmony. It seemed so natural for them, yet for him, this small, everyday act was an unfamiliar world. "Grandpa, come, we want to show you something," said the youngest granddaughter, gently tugging at his arm. Joaquín let himself be guided to the living room, where the warmth of the fireplace and the lights of the Christmas tree created a cozy atmosphere. On the coffee table lay a photo album, one Joaquín didn't recognize. The girl opened it enthusiastically, flipping through the pages while pointing out the images. "Look, here's Dad when he was young. Do you remember this?" Joaquín looked at a photo of Eduardo holding a soccer ball, smiling and carefree with messy hair and a spark of ambition in his eyes. It was an image from simpler times, before arguments and harsh words had driven them apart. As the granddaughter continued turning the pages, Joaquín began to recognize more faces and places. A photo of Eduardo and his mother in the garden Joaquín had planted. Another from a family vacation at the beach. Even one of Joaquín holding Eduardo as a child. Each image was a sharp reminder of the moments he had let slip away, the moments his pride had stolen from him. When they reached the more recent photos, Joaquín saw his grandchildren growing up, their birthdays, graduations, and trips. He wasn't in any of them. His absence was as palpable as the photographs themselves, a void that seemed to scream from the pages filled with memories. His breathing grew heavier, and a lump formed in his throat. He closed the album carefully, his trembling hands caressing the cover. "It's a beautiful album," he finally said, trying to maintain his composure. His granddaughter looked at him with a mix of curiosity and tenderness. "Grandpa, do you have pictures of us at your house?" Joaquín didn't know how to respond. Of course he didn't have them. He hadn't been there to capture those moments. The silence following her question left him exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. Before he could say anything else, Eduardo entered the room carrying dessert. "What are you looking at?" he asked, approaching. When he saw the album, his expression softened. "Ah, we made that album a few years ago. We wanted to gather all the important moments." "It's very beautiful," Joaquín repeated, this time addressing Eduardo. Their eyes met for a moment, and although no words were spoken, both felt the weight of the unspoken emotions between them. As Carmen called everyone back to the table for dessert, Joaquín lingered in the living room a moment longer, staring at the closed album in front of him. He knew he couldn't recover the time he had lost, but in that instant he vowed to do everything in his power not to waste what he still had. The evening slowly moved toward its end, with the grandchildren dozing on the couch and Carmen tidying up the last remnants of dinner. Joaquín looked around, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Yet he also sensed a tension lingering in the air, one he couldn't ignore. Eduardo entered the living room carrying 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Joaquín. "Do you want to stay here a while?" he asked, gesturing to the chairs near the fireplace. Joaquín nodded, taking the cup with both hands to hide the slight tremor that overtook him. At first, the silence between them was comfortable, but it soon grew heavy with unspoken words. Eduardo, sitting with his elbows resting on his knees, stared into the flames dancing in the fireplace before speaking. "Dad," he began, his voice serious but calm. "Why didn't you ever come back? You never called, never tried to fix things. 15 years passed, and we were there, waiting." The words hit Joaquín with an unexpected force. His throat tightened, and his eyes began to burn. He carefully placed the cup on the table, afraid it might slip from his hands. "Eduardo, there hasn't been a single day all these years when I haven't thought about that," he finally responded, his voice breaking. "But I was afraid you wouldn't want anything to do with me, afraid you'd reject me. I couldn't bear that thought, so I convinced myself it was better to stay silent. But I was wrong, son, terribly wrong." Eduardo looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and understanding. "Do you know how hard it was for us? Carmen, the kids, we all needed you, but you weren't there. I thought so many times about reaching out to you, but it made me furious to think you should have been the one to take that step. I always felt like your pride mattered more to you than your family." "I know," Joaquín admitted, tears streaming down his face. "I know, and there's no excuse for it. I just didn't know how to face everything I had done wrong. But I'm here now, Eduardo, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to save whatever we can. I can't change the past, but I can be here now." The silence that followed was filled with emotions the two men shared without needing words. Eduardo stood and walked to the window, looking at the streetlights flickering in the darkness. "It's hard, Dad," he said finally, without turning around. "It's not going to be easy, but maybe we can start over." Joaquín nodded, even though Eduardo couldn't see him. "That's all I want, just one chance to make things right." Eduardo returned to his chair, this time with a more relaxed expression. "Then let's start here tonight. You're here, and that means much more than you think." The conversation ended with an awkward but sincere hug, a small gesture that carried years of pent-up emotions. Although they both knew there were still many things to say and heal that night, they took the first step toward something neither had believed possible: a true reconciliation. The night continued with a silence that now felt comforting, filled with possibilities. Eduardo, still sitting next to Joaquín, let out a long sigh. The sound of the wind outside made the warmth of the fireplace and the soft glow of the Christmas lights feel even cozier. Joaquín looked at his son, searching for the right words to continue, but Eduardo spoke first. "We missed you so much, Dad," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "All these years, I thought maybe you'd decided we weren't important enough to you. But deep down, I always hoped that one day you'd show up at the door as if nothing had happened. I wanted you to come looking for us." Joaquín felt something break inside him. A torrent of emotions overwhelmed him as tears streamed down his face. For so many years, he had feared that his son wouldn't want to see him again, but those words revealed how much time they had lost, how long they had both waited for each other in a silence that should never have existed. "Eduardo, I'm so sorry. I should never have walked away. You and your family. You were always the most important thing to me, even if it didn't seem that way. I just didn't know how to face my mistakes. I don't know how to make up for all these years." Eduardo, his own eyes filled with tears, stood from his chair and walked over to his father. Joaquín looked at him, unsure of what to expect, but when he felt his son's arms around him, his entire body relaxed. It was a sincere hug, full of pain, regret, and love. A hug that seemed to erase, if only for a moment, the lost time. Their sobs broke the silence in the room, and it was then that the grandchildren, watching from the doorway, ran toward them. "Grandpa!" exclaimed the girl as she threw her arms around him, followed by her brother. The weight of all of them together almost made Joaquín lose his balance, but he didn't care. In that moment, all the pain and pride melted away. Carmen, who had been watching from the kitchen, entered the room with a warm smile. She said nothing, simply joining the embrace like another thread in fabric that was beginning to mend. "We're together again," Eduardo murmured, as he hugged his father tightly, "and this time we won't let anything tear us apart." Joaquín closed his eyes, letting the tears flow freely. For the first time in years, he felt his heart, so accustomed to the weight of loneliness, finally complete. He had found his most valuable treasure, his family, once again by his side. A silent promise emerged among them, a promise of unity, of never losing each other again. The clock struck midnight, and the house erupted in a chorus of Happy New Year as the chimes from the television echoed. The lights on the Christmas tree twinkled with a warmth that seemed brighter than ever, and at the table, glasses clinked together amid laughter and cheers. Joaquín, holding a glass of cider, paused to observe his family. Eduardo hugged his wife while the grandchildren entertained themselves, trying to catch streamers floating in the air. Carmen laughed as she half-heartedly tried to maintain order, letting them enjoy the moment. It was all movement, light, and joy. A scene Joaquín had never thought he would experience again. Sitting in a corner of the room, his glass resting on the table, Joaquín closed his eyes for a moment. The echo of laughter filled every corner of the house, as if the walls, silent for so long, had come alive again. It was a sound he had forgotten, one he had once thought lost. "Grandpa, what are you doing sitting over there?" his granddaughter asked, interrupting his thoughts. "Come on, we want you to tell us a story about when Dad was little." Joaquín laughed, surprised by the request. "About when your dad was little? Well, I'm not sure he'd like me telling you those stories," he said, glancing at Eduardo with a playful smile. Eduardo, who had heard from across the room, raised an eyebrow, feigning indignation. "Careful, old man. I've got stories about you too. I could tell them how you used to brag about catching fish with your bare hands in the river, but you never brought any home." The room burst into laughter, and Joaquín couldn't help but join in. In that moment, he realized that the lost time no longer had to define them. There was a new present they could build together, and the scars of the past would serve only as reminders of how far they had come. The hours flew by as they shared memories, stories, and promises to reunite more often. For the first time in years, Joaquín felt the weight on his chest lift. There was room now to breathe, to laugh, to love. And in that instant, amid the lively chatter of his family, he knew he was no longer alone. The next morning arrived with an unusual clarity. Joaquín woke up early, long before the sun reached its peak, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the heavy silence in his home. Though he lay alone in his bed, the echo of laughter from the night before still resonated in his mind, filling him with a warmth he had forgotten could exist. He got up slowly, feeling the cold of the floor beneath his feet, and walked to the small kitchen window. From there, he looked out at his garden, that neglected space that had witnessed happier days, but now seemed to reflect his own state, overgrown, dry, abandoned. But this time, Joaquín didn't see it as a reminder of what he'd lost. Instead, he saw an opportunity for change. After a simple breakfast of bread and coffee, he put on a thick coat and stepped outside. The cold air hit his face, clearing his mind. He walked through the unkempt bushes, observing the dry branches and hardened soil. He stopped by the old rose bush, now little more than a cluster of gnarled twigs. He remembered how his wife had lovingly tended those flowers and how, at one time, he had found joy in seeing them bloom. With renewed purpose, Joaquín went into the small shed he hadn't opened in years. The smell of dust and old wood surrounded him as he rummaged through rusty tools. He found a pair of pruning shears, a rake, and gloves that, while not in the best condition, would do the job. Back in the garden, he began to work. The first branches were tough to cut, but with each snip he felt something inside himself begin to release. He raked up dry leaves, pulled weeds, and loosened the hardened soil. Memories of his wife and the days when the garden was a vibrant space crossed his mind, but this time they didn't bring sadness. Instead, he felt a renewed connection to the space, as if each effort was a promise that it could still flourish. Hours later, the sun was high, and his forehead was damp with sweat. The garden wasn't yet the paradise it had once been, but it no longer looked abandoned. Joaquín paused, leaning on the rake, and surveyed his work. There was an emerging order, a glimpse of what it could become if he continued to care for it. He returned inside the house, feeling an energy he hadn't felt in years. He looked around and thought of all the things he could do: organize the attic, paint the walls, even invite Eduardo and his family over to spend a day there and show them the changes. Joaquín sat in his armchair by the window, gazing at the garden with a light smile on his lips. He knew he wasn't just fixing a physical space but also a part of himself. The garden would bloom, and with it, so would his life. Days turned into weeks, and Joaquín noticed how the loneliness that had defined his life for years began to fade. Eduardo visited every week, sometimes alone, and other times accompanied by Carmen or the children. Each visit brought something different: a conversation about Eduardo's work, a homemade meal Carmen had prepared just for him, or the enthusiastic tales of the grandchildren about their school days. One Saturday morning, Eduardo arrived with a pair of tools in hand and a smile on his face. "How about we fix that fence together, Dad?" he suggested. Joaquín, surprised, nodded in agreement, and the two spent hours working side by side. They didn't need to talk much. Simply spending time together was enough. As they worked, Joaquín felt an invisible gap between them closing, leaving room for something stronger, a connection that had never fully disappeared but was now being rebuilt. His grandchildren also found ways to include him in their lives. One afternoon, they took him to their school to see a play where the youngest performed as a talking tree. Though Joaquín initially felt out of place among the other grandparents, he soon forgot his discomfort when he saw his granddaughter on stage, smiling with enthusiasm. He clapped so loudly that people around him looked at him curiously, but he didn't care. It was the kind of moment he had never imagined having, and he savored it as if it were a gift. On weekends, the children ran through the garden while Joaquín taught them how to plant new flowers. His grandson, more curious, constantly asked why he did each step, and Joaquín was surprised to find answers he thought he'd forgotten. Amid laughter and dirt-covered hands, he showed them how to dig, water, and care for each plant patiently. During quieter nights, when he was alone at home, Joaquín no longer felt the emptiness that had once consumed him. Instead, he looked at the photographs Eduardo had brought during his last visit, now framed and placed on the table. There were pictures of the children, of Carmen, and of the first dinner they had, shared after so many years apart. They were reminders of a life that still had much to offer. One day, Eduardo took him to a larger family gathering with cousins and uncles Joaquín hadn't seen in decades. "Dad, everyone wants to see you," Eduardo said as he helped him into the car. Joaquín, nervous at first, was surprised to be greeted with hugs and kind words from familiar faces who welcomed him as if he had never been gone. With each passing day, Joaquín felt a new life taking root. He couldn't recover the years he had lost, but the present moments with his family were enough to fill that void. He discovered that true wealth lay in his grandchildren's laughter, conversations with his son, and simply sharing a table full of people who loved him. Finally, Joaquín understood that it didn't matter how much time he had left, but how he lived it. And now, surrounded by his family, he had everything he needed. The sun hung low in the sky, bathing Joaquín's garden in a golden light that made the dew on the freshly watered leaves glisten. With pruning shears in hand, Joaquín leaned toward one of the rose bushes that had begun to bloom again. The buds displayed a vibrant color he hadn't seen in years, a silent symbol of the renewal happening in his life as well. A few meters away, his grandchildren ran across the lawn, chasing each other with bursts of laughter. Every so often, one of them paused to pick a flower or ask him a question about the plants. Joaquín watched them with tenderness, their energetic movements contrasting with his slower pace. But there was no envy in his gaze-only pride and deep joy. From the house window, the canary's cage sat open, as always. Pipo hopped back and forth, chirping with a vigor Joaquín couldn't remember hearing before. It was as if the little bird, too, felt the renewed energy filling the home. Joaquín smiled, thinking of how that small companion had been his only connection to life for so many years, and how now its song seemed to celebrate the changes around them. He paused for a moment, resting the pruning shears against the fence. Closing his eyes, he let the warmth of the sun caress his face and the sounds of the garden, the children's laughter, the canary's song, the whisper of the wind through the branches, envelop him. A sense of peace washed over him, one he hadn't felt in a long time. When he opened his eyes, he saw Eduardo stepping out of the house with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Dad, take a break," he said, handing him a cup as he sat in one of the chairs by the garden. Joaquín accepted the coffee and sat beside him, both watching the children continue to play. "The garden looks beautiful," Eduardo remarked after a while. "It's like it's becoming what it used to be." Joaquín nodded, but his gaze stayed on the children. "You know, I always thought lost time couldn't be recovered, and it's true, it can't. But I've also learned it's not about that. It's about what we do with the time we have left." Eduardo looked at him, and in his eyes, Joaquín saw a respect and affection he hadn't seen before. "You've done a lot, Dad, more than you realize." Joaquín smiled, letting the moment speak for itself. He finished his coffee as the sun began to dip behind the trees. Rising, he picked up the shears, determined to finish his task. But before returning to the rose bush, he glanced once more at his family, the grandchildren laughing, Eduardo watching with pride, and the little canary singing without pause. In that instant, Joaquín understood a simple but profound truth. Though the past was filled with mistakes, love had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. And as the garden blossomed around him, he knew that he too had learned to do the same.